Hello, everyone. This is Mathfinder. There are a lot of newcomers on this channel right now. A lot of you came in with my Magus preview, and I suspect many of you will be watching some of my other Impossible Magic previews that are coming up. To all of you, welcome. And to all of the people who have been watching my content this whole time, welcome back. I hope that some of you who came in for the Magus preview stick around and watch some of these other videos. I love presenting my content to all of you, and if there's anything I can do to make it better for your viewing experience, please let me know. And if you aren't already, make sure to subscribe so that you know when I post my upcoming videos, including the rest of what I'll be talking about for Impossible Magic. In today's video, I wanted to talk about something that I have always thought was an interesting conversation. And this is something I wanted to cover pretty much since the very first video I have ever created on this channel. And I just really didn't know how to cover it. I did not know how to quantify it. I just knew, in my gut, that using DPR to quantify these things was a bit of an incomplete metric, but I didn't know what to replace it with. And despite what some may believe, I don't just post my videos to confidently make contrarian claims. I want to really investigate community perceptions and see, is there truth to it or is it false? And the reverse of that, am I just biased or am I really seeing something that a lot of people online aren't? And today's video is going to be about Vicious Swing on the Fighter. Now, to prime us for this discussion about Vicious Swing, we first need to talk about what I'm gonna call idealized damage. Just forget about Vicious Swing for now, and forget about how actual strikes work in this game. We're gonna focus on something hypothetical to help illustrate how spike damage and continuous damage differ. We are now going to be talking about these two ideal damage options. First is the ideal continuous damage. You deal exactly 20 damage every single turn. This is, as some would put it, perfect DPR. And in fact, this is how some people treat DPR. Like, just because your DPR is X, you're pretty much always going to deal X damage every turn, and you should plan all of your turns that way. Which is obviously not the case, but we'll get into that in a moment. And then the next type of damage we'll compare is ideal spike damage. Rather than doing exactly 20 damage every single turn with 100% consistency, you have a 50-50 shot. You will either do 0 damage or 40 damage on every single turn. The probabilities never change, they're not dependent on your 2-hit or the enemy's AC for either of these damages. One of them is 100% consistency, the other is 50% consistency, but note here that they both do have exactly the same mean average, 20 damage per round. But of course, DPR is not that accurate of a tool. It is one tool that helps you characterize damage, and it's particularly good at characterizing continuous damage under mostly ideal circumstances, but aside from that, it just does not always characterize damage properly. I've spoken about this several different times before. For example, in my Blaster Casters video, where just using DPR to evaluate something like, say, Fireball actually just leads you to an incorrect conclusion about how good Fireball is. So instead of looking just at this mean damage of 20 and then just assuming that these two hypothetical idealized damage options are equal, we will instead add one more variable to this question. Consider that you are fighting against an enemy or enemies that have 80 HP to burn through. Exactly. Obviously, ideal continuous damage is going to drop them in 4 turns. 100% of the time. It's going to behave like the White Rumors want DPR to behave. What about ideal spike? How does ideal spike damage behave in this scenario? The exact math isn't hard. It is tedious and long-winded, so I can't really put it up on the screen, but all I really did is I started with an enemy and created a tree where either you hit or you miss, and then I calculated how many paths can you take through that tree. So you hit, miss, and then that goes into hit, miss, and then you have 8 paths after that, and so on and so forth. And I just calculated how many paths can you take where you end up with an enemy 1 hit away from dropping, and then you drop them on turn X. So you're 1 hit away from dropping by turn X minus 1, and then you get dropped on turn X. And it's tedious, but it's not a complicated bit of probability, so I'm not really putting it up on the screen. If you go through all of that painful math, you end up with a chart that looks something like this. This chart is a turns to kill comparison for the ideal continuous damage and the ideal spike damage. The x-axis represents the turn number, turn 1 up till 10, and the y-axis represents the percent probability that you will land the kill on exactly that turn. So for the continuous damage case, the one where you deal exactly 20 damage every single turn to this 80 damage enemy, you're landing the kill 100% of the time on turn 4 and never on any other turn. The orange case, the spike damage, is the one that's a little more interesting. You never land the kill on turn 1 because it's impossible for you to deal 80 damage on the first turn. But 25% of the time, you will land it on turn 2, because all you need is back-to-back hits for 40 damage. Another 25% of the time, you will do it by turn 3, because you just need 2 of your first 3 attempts to be hits, and that also happens 25% of the time. Turn 4 is around 18%. Turn 5 is a little over 10%, something like 12 or 13. Turn 6 is around 8%. Turn 7 is a little under 5%, and then it just keeps decaying. Theoretically, you can also land the kill on turns later than turn 10. The probabilities just get vanishingly small, each smaller and smaller than 1%, 0.1%, so on and so forth, until they're basically negligible. Now let's note some interesting features of this data. You will note that the majority of the time, you're landing the kill as early as or earlier than continuous damage if you use spike damage. 50% of the time, you're going to land the kill on either turn 2 or turn 3, which continuous damage will never do. Another 18%, you'll be tied with continuous damage. And it's just that remaining 30-ish% that you will have worse performance than continuous damage. And even among that 30%, most of the time, you're going to have only slightly worse performance, like a turn or 2 later than the continuous damage. Most of the time, you're not getting to the disaster case scenarios where you're killing an opponent on turn 8 or higher. Now, what does a qualitative analysis of all that data show us? Right off the bat, it tells us that the mean damage, telling us that these are identical damage profiles that just do 20 DPR, isn't true. And I will be linking a post by a former lead designer, Michael Sayre, in the video description below, and in that he talks about how DPR is an incomplete metric, and this is something many people in the Pathfinder community have talked about, and unfortunately many have misunderstood. It's not meant to say that DPR is a bad metric inherently, just that it is one part of a larger conversation, and that's also what I'm saying here. DPR is still going to remain part of this analysis, but it can't be the end of this analysis. Clearly, it's not telling us the whole picture, because the previous graph immediately showed us that these are not identical damage profiles. Now, subjectively, which of these would you say is the better damage profile? It's definitely tough to say. I think on this scenario specifically, I would give the win to Idealized spike damage though, because 50% of the time you land the kill faster than continuous, and only 30-ish% of the time do you land it slower than continuous, and that remaining middle gap is the equal kill. It happened on turn 4 in both cases. I will also say I generally value speeding turn 4 up to turn 3 or 2 to be more valuable than delaying it to turn 5 or 6 would be a downside. There's nothing inherently wrong with a slight delay in the tempo provided your party is able to account for it in other ways, whereas there's something incredibly powerful about bringing tempo so fast that the enemy doesn't get time to set up, deal significant damage, use debilitating effects, and of course, you take so little damage that you might not even need to rest after combat, which is something that can matter at some tables, even if it doesn't matter at all of them. And ultimately, once you consider the party being a factor, those turn 7, 8, 9, and later kills stop existing. You're not really going to land a kill that late, except in exceptional circumstances that pop up maybe once or twice in a campaign. So it's not really something you should be worrying too much about when performing an analysis like this. As far as I'm concerned, combats end by turn 6 unless you have something like waves of enemies coming in on later rounds, or something exceptionally weird has happened and the party has had an incredible string of bad luck with it. But I do gotta say here, if instead of 80 HP I had given the enemy 60 HP, continuous damage wins, hands down, because now it lands a kill on turn 3, not turn 4, but that means that spike damage is much worse, right? Because now you're only faster than continuous 25% of the time, not 30% of the time. But of course, both of these are cherry-picked to some extent. 61 HP means spike damage becomes way better again in this contrived scenario. Ultimately, since we are still talking hypotheticals, we can't robustly account for overkill damage, though I promise you that once we get to the real analysis of this game's math, it will get implicitly accounted for within the math. But if we take a deeper look at what I just said, that idealized continuous wins if the HP threshold was 60 rather than 80, we actually unlock something a little more subtle. Spike damage is actually still a relevant tool, even when continuous damage won the contest. Think about it for a brief moment. I assumed you would only be using ideal continuous, or only be using ideal spike. But what if you can just use both? If on turn 1 you use continuous, dealt 20 HP damage guaranteed, and then on turn 2 you switch to spike, you now have a 50% chance of dropping this enemy on turn 2, which ideal continuous simply cannot do, and then you still have individually on turn 3 another chance of dropping them again to tie with ideal continuous, and then you have a pretty small chance combined of turns 4 or later. So even when continuous is winning the contrived example that I set up earlier, which is turn to kill buckets analysis but with 60 HP instead of 80, the combination of continuous and spike shows that both remain relevant tools. The reverse wasn't true, by the way. When spike damage was better, it was pretty much just better, and changing your rotation to incorporate some continuous damage wasn't inherently worth it unless you were feeling really risk averse. And in fact, it would go so far as to imply that if spike had a higher DPR than idealized continuous, or if, say, the kill thresholds were consistently so high that you needed the spikes to get there and that you were rarely doing overkill, which we'll get into later in this video, how do you convert between DPR and kill thresholds meaningfully, well, idealized spike would be a clean win. And from experience, that is how power attack feats that are the analog of Vicious Swing work in other games. D&D 5th edition, not 5.5, 5th edition, has Great Weapon Master and Sharpshooter, and both of them give you a -5 to attack and +10 to damage. Both of them are a clean DPR increase over just making a regular attack against anything but the highest ACs, which means you should always use them, because if your average damage is high enough and your spikes are way higher, why would you ever not use them? So the only reason not to use power attacks in D&D 5e is the enemy so low on HP that you don't even need the damage boost? Or does the enemy just have crazy high AC? And in anything but those circumstances, they're just a strict upgrade over attacking. A similar thing is true in Pathfinder 1st edition for power attack. I believe it is a raw DPR increase over not using it, but I might be wrong about that. I haven't analyzed PF1E. Regardless, the next sentiment is true for both games. Both 5th editions and Pathfinder 1st edition's power attack feats are designed such that their DPR is high enough that it is objectively correct to give them accuracy boosts and then build around them. In D&D 5e, this might look like the Barbarian's Reckless Attack or the Archery Fighting style. In Pathfinder 1st edition, it's the Weapon Focus feats. Those accuracy boosts take something that was already a little bit strictly better than just using a regular attack and make it way better. And that leads us to our thesis. Spike damage kind of needs to have lower on paper DPR than continuous damage for them to ever be equal. And these idealized cases illustrate that point. If they happen to have equal DPR, then that just means spike damage is better at a baseline because you're performing the same in the long run and you're getting these random really good spikes. And therefore, it's also strictly better to build around. If you have any way of improving the unreliability of those spikes, you must use them because the baseline damage is so high and the peak damage is so high that any downside reduction makes it overpowered. Whereas when spike damage has lower DPR, it is going to remain one valuable tool in your kit, as we showed in the 60 HP versus 80 HP case, where spamming spike damage caused your effective DPR to drop because of overkill damage, but combining spike damage with continuous damage did not cause that. And this will be foundational to the rest of our analysis. Now we can get talking about vicious swing specifically. And just right off the bat, spamming at every single turn is simply not the intended use case of vicious swing. If it was, that would mean it's a strict upgrade over just using those two actions to make basic strikes. Or, well, a nearly strict upgrade, because of course some circumstances, like the enemy being really, really, really low on HP, or you just needing to split your movement or something like that, might mean that you should not vicious swing. But most feats are not intended to even replace basic strikes in like 90% of situations, like this hypothetical version of a spammable vicious swing would be. There are exceptions, of course. There are some feats that feel like strict upgrades over basic actions. But usually, they're build around feats, like Double Slice. And these feats are typically attached to a playstyle that would otherwise be too underpowered. Double Slice exists because dual wielding is not that good without it, so any class that's intended to thematically be able to dual wield needs access to something that gives them a little bit of sauce with dual wielding just to make it worth doing. And of course, there are also high-level exceptions. The fighter themselves has Needle in the God's Eyes. And honestly, this might just still be a real design mistake, but I'm not going to treat it as such. I am going to just say that sure, fighters are intended to be able to replace the basic strike action by level 16, which is fine. Now, there is a very common way of comparing Vicious Swing to the two basic strikes you could otherwise have taken. DPR versus DPR. And of course, this is flawed for many reasons. Most of those reasons are the ones we just established, and I don't need to reiterate. But let's add one more reason here. When we compare via DPR, we are inherently just refusing to account for the fact that you might switch sometimes between the two. You're saying you will always pick one or always pick the other? Like, if Vicious Swing wins the DPR contest, then you will always Vicious Swing. And if Two Strikes wins the DPR contest, you will always use two basic strikes. And I understand that we could change the parameters of the contest. Maybe Vicious Swing wins the DPR contest when there's a resistance coming up, and at other times Two Strikes wins. But the point is that we're kind of just not accounting that within the same combat, in very similar circumstances, depending on how it's going, you might switch between the two. Inherently, we're going back to saying, if Vicious Swing is not good enough to spam, it's not good enough to use. And this is an argument that sort of defeats itself, because you're inherently assuming that if Vicious Swing is not good enough to spam, you should spam its alternative. Whereas the intended playstyle is to just switch between the two as needed. No spamming required. So here we will build a better comparison that hopefully illustrates the use cases of Vicious Swing. To build our better comparison, though, we need to obviously do a lot of mathematical setup. So let's get started with that. Obviously, we're talking about a fighter, and we will be doing this analysis for all of levels 1 to 20. And the analysis we're doing is a TTK one, turns to kill. What we're going to do is set up a few different damaging routines, apply them to an enemy with real HP while rolling real attack rolls with the d20 and all relevant modifiers, and rolling real damage rolls to see how much their HP goes down by until it hits 0. And once it hits 0, we'll mark that as a kill. We'll do that 50,000 times, average that for that level's TTK, then move on to the next level and repeat the process. We are maxing out strength 4 at level 1, 5 at level 10, 6 at level 17 because of the Apex item, and 7 at level 20. We're also assuming automatic bonus progression in terms of when you get your weapons runed up. So +1 to 3 runes at levels 2, 10, and 16, and then striking runes at level 4, 12, and 19. We're going to assume the weapon is a D10 weapon at a baseline. Just remember that if you were to use a D12 weapon, the numbers would favor Vicious Swing more, and likewise if you use D8 weapon, it would favor it less. And we are also going to be adding a 1d6 property rune at levels 8, 10, and 16. Why are we doing this? One of the big arguments against Vicious Swing is that even if you consider it relevant in low-level play, it stops being relevant once your weapon damage die stops being a big part of your damage. And that is most notable at level 8, because you just got weapon specialization at level 7, and you added another d6 from the property rune, and from this point forwards, the damage die is only going to become less and less relevant, not more. And of course, embedded in that argument is the assumption that the extra damage die Vicious Swing gives you at levels 10 and 18 does not keep up with this progression. So I need to incorporate this damaging progression into my argument for my argument to even be valid. Now here is the enemy we're targeting. It is going to be a boss 2 levels above the party with high AC, low reflex, you'll see why reflex matters soon, and completely middle of the road HP, the literal middlemost point I could pick on the row for that creature for HP. Why am I using a boss here? Well, I like to use bosses as my metric for single target damage. That being said, you could repeat the experiment with minions. You would probably have similar results. I did check with the PL-2 with one small alteration, and it made sense. The results were roughly the same between the two cases. One important note, though, is that we are not assuming that this fighter needs to deal 100% of the boss's HP in damage. That's because you're gonna have a party. 50% is the threshold we're going with, which I think is reasonable for a good damage dealer. Think about the parties you've been in. They often have 2 good damage dealers and 2 poke damage dealers. And these roles might switch combat to combat. There might be one combat where a blaster caster is doing the most damage and one where a melee marshal is. But generally speaking, I think it's fair to say that the majority of the damage of the party, close to 70 to 80%, usually comes from 2 characters in any given combat. And then the remaining 20 to 30% tends to be the off turns of the other characters, where they're not setting up debuff control buff states. 50% is thus my metric for I am a good damage dealer, I am good enough of a damage dealer to offset some bad luck from the other good damage dealer, and presumably they have built in a way that offsets my bad luck too. More on that later. But 50% is the threshold I will use for boss fights. Note here that if you wish to redo this math on your own, I would recommend not using 50% if you're doing minions. 50% only makes sense against a boss, because when you're fighting a single tough enemy, it's virtually impossible for you to be dealing all of the damage to that foe. The highest I have ever seen in a combat was like 70% of the damage came from one character and the 30% came from the remaining 3. But even that was an exception within an exception. That's only ever happened one single time for me. But if the enemy were a minion, yeah, you might deal 100% of the damage to a minion all by yourself. So at that point, I would up this threshold. Maybe 75% for on-level foes and 100% for minions, something of the sort. Now, what are the damaging routines we're going to be analyzing? First, there is the baseline, making 2 strikes per turn. Now, why am I assuming 2 strikes? Why not 3? We get 3 actions, right? Well, as a melee character, I would say it's genuinely unreasonable to assume that you can always use 3 actions towards offense. You can't. Sometimes you're going to have to stride. Sometimes you're going to have to take defensive actions. Sometimes you're going to be using debuffs or buffs or recon knowledge or something useful of the sort that's not just damage. So I'm assuming 2 offensive actions per turn and a 3rd auxiliary action that's not on this spreadsheet. Obviously, if you were to account for 3, the numbers would change. I will do a qualitative breakdown of what I think those numbers will look like were I to do that. And note here that 2 strikes means you have the multiple attack penalty, -5 on your 2nd strike, until level 16, where I'm assuming this fighter picked Needle in the God's Eyes to remove multiple attack penalty entirely. And then the second routine I want to talk about is the one that I am making my claim about. We'll be using 2 strikes per turn until the foe is a little higher than the average damage of Vicious Swing. I use 120% as my little higher metric. Once you're at that point, we will switch to using Vicious Swing until the foe gets back down to the point where they're a little under where a single strike would drop them. I think this little over, little under thing is a good way of representing it. Theoretically, you might want to start using Vicious Swing when the enemy is at the point where the average damage of the Vicious Swing is exactly enough to kill them, but there are 2 problems there. 1, you're not giving yourself the chance to get lucky with a crit, and 2, and this is important, you can't predict the exact HP an enemy is at. There's going to be some noise. There's going to be some error. So by going a little over the threshold, I am sort of embedding that uncertainty. I'm embedding the fact that your GM is not going to tell you the enemy is at 40 HP. They're going to say something more like, he's looking bad, he's bloodied, he is on death's door, or something of the sort. And likewise for the 80% of the normal strike, dropping them. 1, you're not going to have a precise measure of exactly when they stopped being within Vicious Swing's threshold and started being within a single strike's threshold. And the other thing is that, let's say an enemy has exactly enough HP that, on average, a hit from a strike kills them. That means 50% of the time, a hit from a strike doesn't kill them, right? So in fact, when you're right on the threshold, if you had perfect information, I would say you should still go for Vicious Swing, not a regular strike. Once you're under that threshold is when I'm like, okay, start going back to strikes now. Any 1 strike landing is very likely to kill this opponent. And this slightly above Vicious Swing threshold, slightly below strike threshold is my way of basically encoding judicious use of Vicious Swing. Vicious Swing is a spike damage tool. You cannot spam it. You have to understand when those spikes are relevant. Obviously, in the case of a White Room simulation, I cannot perfectly understand the when or why or how of using spike damage. So once I convince you with these routines, we will talk about judicious use of Vicious Swing, what that looks like at the table. But you have to first buy my argument that there is such a thing that makes Vicious Swing worth it. And note here, because I am putting a conditional on Vicious Swing, it's only fair that I track how often Vicious Swing actually got used in my simulations. Because what if I just arbitrarily set thresholds to the point where Vicious Swing is not being used at all, right? On average, Vicious Swing is used 1.3 times per combat in lower levels, so 1 to 2 times leaning to 1, which makes sense because in low levels, once you use Vicious Swing, there's just a very high chance the enemy drops. And in higher levels, it's gone to 1 per combat. For very few levels, it dips to around 0.98, which means there's a few combats where you just never use Vicious Swing. But again, that falls within the purview of judicious use of Vicious Swing. If you have landed many back-to-back crits, you might just skip over the threshold of Vicious Swing being worth using, and that is just you reacting to the combat in front of you. If you're getting immensely lucky, don't give yourself a chance to get unlucky with Vicious Swing. Makes sense, right? Then I used Slam Down starting at level 4 as another routine, with the idea being you strike this foe, you trip them, then they stand back up, which we will assume they always do, and you get a reactive strike out of it, so long as you successfully trip the foe. Why did I include Slam Down? Because Slam Down is a bit of a baseline that the community accepts is a good high-risk, high-reward 2 actions. I figured that including Slam Down on this chart will sort of give people who believe in Slam Down spammability, but not in Vicious Swing's usability, some kind of a metric to offset their own bias. I will note here, I have encoded advantages to Slam Down here, right? I'm allowing Slam Down to use their reaction because anytime the enemy is tripped, they get to reactive strike. But obviously, the other 2 routines will also get to use reactive strike some of the time. Maybe the enemy just moved around you. Maybe somebody else tripped them. I assume no reactive strikes for them, so I effectively assume no reaction for them. Likewise, on that second strike, I did assume Slam Down is against an off-guard enemy, which off-guard is an easy condition to inflict when you're a melee character, so why am I not assuming off-guard for everyone? Here's my rationale. Slam Down is not just a damaging option. Slam Down is a way to help your party by potentially taking away enemy actions or debuffing them. Slam down doesn't just trigger your reactions, it also triggers other people's reactions. Between all of those factors, slam down will probably have a comparably high TTK, and crashing slam will almost certainly have a higher TTK when used, despite having a higher risk. But all of those external factors, the one where the rest of your party is being benefited, don't show up on the spreadsheet because I'm not simulating their damage, only yours. That's why I figured it's okay to give slam down a bit of a crutch in terms of the analysis, and I don't think I'm doing anything wrong here. And if you think that I shouldn't, let me know in the comments, and I guess just ignore the slam down numbers and conclusions I draw in the next few slides. The rest of the math is still interesting and valid without it. And of course, crashing slam is assumed starting from level 10 onwards, so only for levels 4 to 9 do you actually need to do strike followed by a trip attempt. And note here that I'm assuming athletics is maxed out as much as possible for that levels 4 to 9 range as well. Finally, spamming vicious swing. This is sort of my terrible floor analysis, and you'll see why it's coming up soon. So with all of that set up, what does the math end up looking like? Well, you should get something that looks like this chart. The x-axis is the level range, 1 up till 20. The y-axis is the turns to kill, computed as per what I mentioned at the beginning of the previous slide. There are 4 lines on this chart. The white line is the baseline, 2 strikes per turn. The purple line is the slam down routine, where you try to get yourself a reactive strike. The green line is the judicious vicious swing routine, where you make strikes until you believe the enemy is in a threshold where vicious swing will one-shot them, and then you start using vicious swing, stopping once you believe that a single strike will one-shot them. And finally, there's the red line, the worst of all the lines, spamming vicious swing. Now let's get the red line out of the way first. From levels 1 to 3, there's nothing meaningful to talk about. Everything has very, very, very near identical performance. At levels 4 to 20 is where spamming vicious swing falls off a cliff. And it does get better for some levels, like levels 10 to 11 is not terrible, but it never actually catches up again. It only gets really bad, like say levels 8 to 9, or really, really bad like level 17, or still just bad at levels 10 to 12. So why did I include it? What's it even doing on this chart? Think about it for a second. What does DPR mean, if given to you without additional context? It's the mean damage you do in a round. When somebody presents you that number, comparing the DPR of A to the DPR of B, and saying, well, A has better DPR, well, you're inherently assuming that this is being used round after round, right? Hence, damage per round. Like when I tell you something has 9.1 DPR, you're never actually dealing 9.1 damage. That's physically impossible in Pathfinder. What you're actually doing is dealing some amount of damage, higher, lower, round after round, that averages out to that 9.1 number I gave you. When I now say that something else deals 8 DPR, you're also fundamentally assuming that round after round, you're doing the same kind of damage until it averages to 8. But if you don't stop to think of, is this even a good way to use the Vicious Swing feat? Well, your comparison's invalid. So the red line basically just exists so that you're not misled by DPR comparisons in the future. If somebody just presents with the DPR of two things, A and B, and says A has higher DPR, therefore it's better, this is what they're showing. They're comparing just the white line to just the red line, and obviously the red line has worse DPR because situational options, by their very nature, cannot be spammed, and if they're spammed, they would get worse performance. With the red line out of the way, let's look at everything else. You will notice that the white line and the green line are competitive throughout the level ranges until we get to level 16, where the white line starts getting slightly better TTK consistently, and it really is slight. It's like 0.25 turns on average. Before that, there's barely any difference. We're talking one will be 0.1 ahead at some levels and one will be 0.1 ahead at other levels. Barely a meaningful difference. And finally, let's talk about slam down. Like I said, I incorporated slam down into this chart because I wanted a bit of a showcase of a 2-action, high-risk, high-reward option that the community already perceives as being good. At levels 4 to 9, your TTK is actually worse than both just using 2 strikes and judiciously using Vicious Swing, Even though I gave all of these advantages to Slamdown, I assume they're the only ones getting Reactive Strike. I gave them off guard against the foe, so this should offset some of the teamwork value that Slamdown generates. I think the conclusion here is clear. The community sort of overrates how good Slamdown is as a spammable 2-action option for levels 4 to 9, and then starting at level 10, it has an accurate judgment. Crashing Slam is a crazy good feat. I don't consider that a bad thing. Level 10 feats are usually meant to be very powerful. Like, think about it, in the level 8 to 12 range, what sorts of feats are we talking about? Tactical reflexes, disruptive stance, lunging stance. Of course Crashing Slam is crazy. It has to be just to be worth picking. And clearly it shows. Like, from levels 10 to 15, it has the best TTK by a pretty good margin, and at level 16, once the other two routines are unconditionally getting their Mapless Strike, and you're conditionally getting yours, their TTK gets better than you again. But Crashing Slam is still worth it because it has good TTK, while also having a controlling effect or a debuffing effect, depending on whether the enemy stands up or not. So overall, I would say all of the routines are pretty even from levels 1 up till 20, with Crashing Slam having a distinct advantage at levels 10 to 15. And conversely, I would say Vicious Swing, when used judiciously, is very, very close in value to 2 strikes. Now, let's talk about something I like to call realized DPR. Let's make an important note first. A TTK analysis is actually just a more accurate representation of DPR. It is inherently more accurate than calculating DPR upfront without an HP threshold. Here is an example. If you deal 30 DPR, you drop your 70 HP foe in 3 turns. But now that 30 DPR is contributing towards 20 HP of overkill, because you dealt 90 damage in those 3 turns on average. But if you work backwards, overkill damage does not exist. Let's say that you ran a simulation and determined that you would drop the 70 HP foe in 3 turns. You can then compute that your effective DPR was 70 divided by 3, 23.33 DPR. You negated overkill implicitly by virtue of this analysis. So calculating DPR upfront means you have to explicitly account for overkill, which most people don't, whereas TTK implicitly does so. And as mentioned before, upfront DPR calculations open yourself up to over-centralizing. Like when you compare 2-action Vicious Swing versus 2-action strikes, you're fundamentally not allowing yourself to first make a few strikes and then use Vicious Swing. Something we already showed at the start of this video is a useful way of using spike damage. So from the previous slide, every single point on the graph shows you TTK numbers. If something has a lower TTK, it will have a higher realized DPR. You take the HP of the enemy we were calculating the TTK against, divide it by the TTK, you will get realized DPR. Likewise, if two things have an equal TTK or nearly equal TTK, then they have equal or nearly equal realized DPR. Don't need to calculate DPR up front, calculate realized DPR after the fact, and it is nearly equal. Why does that matter? It matters because of what we established earlier with our idealized continuous and idealized spike damage scenarios. When DPR is identical or near identical, we need to look deeper. We can't just use DPR to make our conclusion anymore, because at the beginning of that video, clearly idealized continuous and idealized spike were not identical. So let's zoom in to our analysis. If you go back to the previous slide, you will notice that level 11 is where the TTK is most identical for the 2 strikes versus the judicious vicious swing option. So that is what we'll zoom into. This is a TTK breakdown for level 11. The formatting is very much like the TTK buckets you saw for the idealized damage near the beginning of this video. The x-axis is turns, the y-axis is probability of landing a kill on exactly that turn, blue is the continuous damage option, orange is the spike damage option. It's just that unlike that slide, it's much less peaky. It's a much more gradual distribution, but there's still information to be gleaned here. You'll also notice that I cut the analysis off at turn 12. There are probabilities that are non-zero above turn 12 too, but I cut it off at that point because all of them are collectively barely adding up to 1% of cases. They are practically a rounding error and are not worth considering once you realize that you're not dealing all the damage alone, you have a party. If you're getting that exceptionally unlucky, chances are somebody else's average luck will have dropped the enemy anyways. So it's irrelevant to consider them. Even turns 10, 11, 12 here are really stretching the bounds of believability. When have you ever had a combat go that long without external factors like enemies showing up in waves or like terrain features or whatever? I think I've had it happen one singular time, and that was a crazy exception with at least one other exceptional factor coming in. So really, this analysis is not supposed to be taken all the way up to turn 12 even, but I'm taking it just for the completeness of the distribution. I will also add here, you might look at this chart and say, wow, these TTKs are late. The average TTK is like 6? That's so much higher than it's been in my experience in high-level play. Well, I did assume you have to solo deal 50% of the damage of the boss. In a more realistic scenario, you would probably deal 35%, somebody else would probably deal 35%, somebody else will deal 20, somebody else will deal 10, and that'll total up to 100, and the TTK will be lower. In my experience, a whole party's TTK in these higher levels of play tends to be 4 to 5 on the higher end, especially for a level plus 2 boss. A level plus 2 boss will drop quickly in high level play, pretty much in 2 to 3 turns. But like, I had to draw a threshold somewhere, I drew it at 50%. Your analysis might differ if you use a different threshold. Now let's go turn by turn. Nothing to be gained at turns 1 to 2. Turn 3, 4, 5, you can see that the orange bar is higher. Judicious Vicious Swing will more frequently land an early kill than using 2 strikes per turn. Turns 6, 7, and 8 are the more frequent ones for 2 strikes, and then you'll notice that the extremities, turns 11 and 12, are more frequent for Vicious Swing again, with turn 10 being identical for the two nearly. This basically means that this is a smoothed out version of exactly what we saw with Idealized Spike and Idealized Continuous. The blue bar tends towards the middle of the distribution. In this case, 5 to 8 turns. In the case of the Idealized damage, exactly 4 turns. The orange bar, the spike damage case, tends towards the lower end of the distribution. It's actually likelier to land spikes even when they have identical DPR or effective DPR. And the orange distribution opens yourself up to poor luck, which means you're likelier to get to those extremes at the higher level of play. So the trend really is the same. Vicious Swing, when used properly, will give you that higher reward of early kills and the higher risk of later kills, even when the DPR is nearly identical to just using 2 strikes. And again, if you don't like that the TTK over here is centered on turn 6, you can redo my simulation with a threshold of like 30%, and the whole distribution will shift to the left. You will still have the same trend. Vicious Swing is likelier to be in the early range of that and in the latest range of that, and strikes are likeliest to be in the middle range of that. Now that we have looked at all of the math, let's start doing some qualitative analysis on everything we saw. First, our key takeaway, the most important part, is that Vicious Swing is very consistently equivalent to making 2 strikes in terms of its effective DPR if you use it judiciously, and this is important. If you spam it, if you just look at its actual DPR, it's bad, but let's look at how to use it properly. It has a high risk, high reward of landing early kills. When you're using Vicious Swing judiciously, you will have earlier kills more often, and the worst case scenario of late kills a little more often too, but still enough of a difference that Vicious Swing is worth it, whereas 2 strikes will have flat performance. High floor, low peak is 2 strikes, and high risk, high reward is Vicious Swing. And if something has equal performance on average, but high risk, high reward, that means it's both worth setting up for proactively and worth using when its upsides are worth it. And that means that the assumed premise of Vicious Swing being a bad use of your actions is just wrong. So let's talk about those upsides. Let's build all of our qualitative analysis with those key takeaways in mind. What advantages does Vicious Swing have? What are these advantages that would make us use it? The first is the one that everyone talks about. If the enemy has resistances, this is good at bypassing those resistances because one big hit does better than two smaller ones, especially when the first one is mapless. Everyone already agrees with it. I have pretty much never seen anyone disagree with the takeaway that Vicious Swing should be used against, say, constructs or whatever if you don't have an adamantine weapon, but it does recontextualize it. This is not a bad damaging option that's now okay to use. This is an already decent or good damaging option that became great to use because everything else sucks so bad. And then there are plenty more. First up, if you have any reason to believe the enemy is low on HP, just use Vicious Swing. Ask your GM, how does the enemy look? Most of the time, you can glean some information. On Foundry, you will have this color-coded descriptor below a lot of NPC names, depending on the GM you play with, that makes it pretty easy to tell. But if you're not on Foundry, like this is a role-playing game, it is okay to just ask the GM, how ruffled up, how wounded does this foe look? And they might say, he's winded, he's bloodied, he's injured, he's severely injured, he's on death's door. And I can't give you a perfect metric of how to convert all of that into HP thresholds in your head, but the longer you play with the GM, the more you're going to get a feel for what they call severely wounded, and that will help you figure out when to start using Vicious Swing. That will help you get closer and closer to that good performance of the judicious Vicious Swing graph that I showed you. The next advantage is rounding out 3 action turns. Remember, all of my analyses assumed that you don't get to have 3 offensive actions, only 2. Slam Down was the one that got 2 offensive actions and a reactive strike. But Vicious Swing is really, really good at 3 action turns. Because you can have sort of good damage, almost like you use 2 mapless attacks that did 2.5 attacks worth of damage in some ways. Especially once you get Furious Focus. Once you have Furious Focus and Vicious Swing can be your mapless attack, and then you can follow it up with a regular strike in only map 5 and not map 10, it will probably have a better 3 action turn than every alternative we mentioned. I think the only possible 3 action turn that a melee fighter can get that will have consistently better TTK than Vicious Swing with Furious Focus plus a strike is Exacting Strike, because you can go strike, then use Exacting Strike, and then if you miss, you make another map 5 attack, and that can also be a press strike of some kind. So it's a very high value thing to use Exacting Strike. But there is a difference. Exacting Strike is literally only good when you have a 3 action offensive turn. Vicious Swing has other advantages, and then is also the second best way a fighter has, second only to Exacting Strike, of rounding out a 3 action offensive turn on a melee character. So this is a fantastic upside of Vicious Swing. Then consider that it makes better use of one-shot accuracy boosts. Let's say somebody used Aid on you. Let's say a commander used Setup Strike and or Fortunate Blow. Let's say a bard used True Target on the party. Let's say you have Sure Strike in some way. Or maybe there's an Infinite Eye Psychic. Or let's just say you have a hero point. There are a number of one-use accuracy bonuses that only affect one attack you take, not the whole lot. And when you have a one-use accuracy bonus, especially when it's Fortune, Vicious Swing gets so much better. I didn't have the space in this video to do an analysis, but I did quickly check what happens if you just gave the first strike of every routine a +3, and Vicious Swing got crazy good with that, to the point that spamming now had good TTK, and the judicious use had great TTK. So anytime one-use accuracy bonuses are in consideration, Vicious Swing is actually a pretty good option. And remember, you can ask for those. You can always just tell someone, hey, can you aid me? I want to try and land a big crit with my Vicious Swing. And this is what I meant by the takeaway of it is worth setting up for. You can just ask for the setup you need in the situations you need it, and it will play fantastically. Then there's the fact that you might pick property runes that are not the 1d6 damaging ones. I talked about this in my property runes video, linked above. Other property runes are also good. You might just want a rooting rune or a grievous rune or something of the sort. And if you do, you don't have one of those 1d6s that makes Vicious Swing a little bit worse to use in higher level play. which means now it's more of an option. And finally, when there are equal or lower level foes, all of these advantages get amplified. Vicious Swing is good at dropping low HP enemies. A minion spends half their life at low HP because it doesn't take a lot to get them to that threshold. Vicious Swing plays really nice with Fortune. Low level enemies are where Fortune is actually at its best because it inflates your crit range too, not just your hit range. Using Vicious Swing to make up for a lack of damaging property runes, non-damaging property runes use crit riders, which are at their best against lower level foes. So when you look at equal or lower level foes, all of these qualitative advantages just get better. If you were to replicate the math on a spreadsheet, actually 2 strikes versus Vicious Swing would still come out looking identical. But once you account for how you're using Vicious Swing judiciously, it definitely is a competitive way of getting lower level foes. And that is where Vicious Swing really sits. It is not just a bad option. The DPR analysis is misleading because it makes a bunch of assumptions, obfuscates them, and embeds them into this flat, contextless number. When you break it down, when you think about how you will use Vicious Swing, it is a high-risk, high-reward option that you can set up and guess at when it's good to use, and the better you get at doing this, the more Vicious Swing will be a part of your toolkit. And then, when situational things like bypassing resistances or using Furious Focus to round out your turns come up, they will feel like a cherry on top of a decent option that takes decent and pushes it up to great. And that brings me to a larger conversation about spike damage. We often simply make the mistake of evaluating spike damage through the lens of DPR. Vicious Swing is decent, gets misunderstood as bad, but Vicious Swing is not the only spike damage option. For example, is Spell Strike even better than the community perceives it to be? It might be, because a lot of people who analyze Spell Strike are doing so based on a DPR lens. But as we just established, that DPR lens is making inane assumptions about how you're using your spike damage. You're not using it to secure a spike in damage, you're just spamming it. Hell, is Megaton Strike, especially the unstable version, better than we perceive it to be? Well, I don't know the answer for a fact. They might be, they might not be. Maybe Spell Strike really is better than people think it is, but maybe Megaton Strike isn't. Maybe Megaton Strike just sucks and inventors are in shambles. What I have done here is set up Vicious Swing as a very clean baseline. Vicious Swing is a level 1 feat, which means a lot of people are aware of it. It's on the Fighter, a class that a lot of people know, and it is an often maligned feat, which means it sets up the most convincing argument to show people that spike damage is misevaluated. And of course, the Fighter is a class that can just get away with 2 strikes per turn and nothing else, right? The Fighter is a fundamentally pretty good damage dealer. Get a sword, get a shield, and just make 2 strikes every turn, occasionally make a reactive strike, and your third action is either raise a shield or stride. This is baseline decent performance, and you'll still do fine provided your party is picking up the slack for all the versatility you dropped. So if Vicious Swing can convincingly live up to this bar, well, other spike damage options can now have a reasonable conversation. So this video is sort of establishing a baseline that I will use for all future videos. Vicious Swing is good. If you didn't agree before, maybe after watching this video you're convinced. If you still don't agree, leave a comment and tell me why you still disagree, and I'll see what I can do to bring you over. But once you buy this baseline, that Vicious Swing is a fundamentally decent spike damage option, we can now start to have conversations about other spike damage options. And we will have those conversations in future videos. In general, this applies to every piece of spike damage, not just Vicious Swing. Spike damage is a tool. Use it when the time is right and acknowledge that it's always going to be a gamble. If you spam it, it will underperform. This is by design, because if spamming it was good enough, it would replace continuous damage, as we have seen in D&D 5th edition with the power attack feats. So spamming it is always going to be bad. This is true for virtually all spike damage options in the game. Just about the only exception, I think, is the Starlit Span Magus spamming Spell Strike, which is something they can get away with. But other spike damage options, not good to spam. None of them. Not even a melee Magus' spell strike. You should be looking at options that are not just spamming if you want to do well. And the use it when the time is right is the key. In general, some of Vicious Swing's advantages are just inherent to spike damage. It's always good against low HP enemies. It's always good against resistances. And it's always good if you have a one-use accuracy buff. But the other advantages might be more situational. Vicious Swing had Furious Focus as an advantage, for example, which not all options do. Those options might have their own advantages, which you have to evaluate, and I will evaluate in future videos. And that will be it for today's video, folks. I hope you enjoyed this video. This has been a very complex topic to broach. I have wanted to cover spike damage versus continuous damage in a single target sense for the longest time. It's very easy to do for AoE, not so easy for single target damage, and I think I have finally nailed it. I think this video is a convincing argument of Vicious Swing, when used judiciously, being decent enough to use. And I hope I have convinced some of you of it. I hope some of the people who dislike Vicious Swing are coming around on it. Again, I am not trying to be contrarian. I am not trying to claim that Vicious Swing is somehow the best feat and people should be spamming it. No, if you spam it, it'll do horribly. Pick it if you can, use it judiciously when you can, and it will perform well, and it will have upsides, because spike damage inherently does have upsides. And this will build into a deeper understanding on this channel and hopefully throughout the community of how to use spike damage options. My next video in this series will be an interesting one. It is going to be covering spike damage, but not from the class you expect. I will be analyzing the Investigator soon, and I feel like that will be a very fun analysis now that Vicious Swing has set up the baseline. If you enjoyed this video, please like and comment. Every bit of engagement helps the channel. If you want to see my future videos, especially my upcoming series of Impossible Magic videos where I talk about various spells, classes, etc., make sure to subscribe and click the channel notifications button. If you want to directly support me, please consider joining a channel membership. Regardless, I'll see you next time. Mathfinder out.